Chapter 1. The Distant Thunder. I remember the wind first. It carried a ghostly hush across the plains, like a distant breath warning us that our lives would never be the same. I was just a girl. A mere 13 winters had passed since my birth, when that hush found its way into my heart. My name is Zintkala, which means bird in the Lakota tongue, and I was born under the wide sky of the Oglala Lakota. The elders told me that my laughter had once reached the ears of our ancestors across the spirit world. So bright and free it was. Yet in those days before Wounded Knee, my laughter grew scarce, replaced by worry and questions I was too young to answer. Snow crystals clung to the dry grass, crackling underfoot as our people prepared to move. We had heard rumors about the soldiers, bluecoats we called them, who drew closer each day. The older men spoke in urgent whispers, gathering around small fires late into the night. Sometimes I would listen, hidden behind the flickering silhouettes. The adults mentioned the ghost dance, a ceremony that promised a return of our old ways. They spoke with cautious hope, their voices trembling between fear and longing. From the top of a small hill near our winter camp, I would gaze across the plains that stretched endlessly in every direction. The sky was always so big, as if it cradled our hopes within a massive, ever-shifting tapestry of clouds. In those moments, I felt dwarfed by the land I loved, a land that both gave us life and threatened to swallow us. I clutched my small knife at my belt and whispered a promise to keep safe my mother, father, and little brother, Tasunke. He was only 7 winters old, yet as fearless as a prairie hawk. He followed me everywhere, humming tunes he learned from our grandmother's lullabies. Despite the winter chill, the tension in our camp felt hot, like embers left smoldering. Chief Spotted Elk, who some called Bigfoot, and other leaders tried to steady our spirits, but the songs they sang at night carried an undercurrent of worry. One evening, I found my father staring at the stars in silence, his hand trembling around his pipe. I had seen many emotions in his eyes, pride when I learned to ride, joy when Tasunke was born. But that night, I saw a sadness that curled deep in his soul, hidden behind the reflection of starlight. He spoke softly, as though the wind might carry his words to unfriendly ears. Zintkala, our people walk on the edge between 2 worlds, the old ways and the new ways. We must hold to our traditions, but we must also survive. I knelt beside him, placing my small hand on his broad one. Father, what is it you fear? His jaw clenched, and for a moment, he was silent. I fear the thunder I see on the horizon, the kind that brings no rain but only destruction. We are surrounded, my daughter. My heart aches at what might happen to us. I wanted to tell him it would be all right, that the Great Spirit watched over us. But the words died on my tongue. That hush, that warning in the wind, seemed to echo all around, promising a storm that no prayer could hold back. When dawn broke the next day, I rose early and joined my mother to help her pack our meager belongings. Every step felt heavy, as if the ground knew we were leaving behind more than just footprints. Women and children shuffled around the center of camp, their eyes carrying worry and fatigue. Warriors kept a steady watch, scanning the horizon for the first sign of bluecoats. And still, the wind carried that same ghostly hush, the unspoken fear in every mother's soft commands, every father's stern gaze. It played on the edges of our thoughts, a lonely song with no chorus. Yet amidst the tension, a flicker of resolve pulsed through our people. We were Lakota. Strength and pride flowed in our veins. Even as a young girl, I could feel the spirit of my ancestors standing beside me, urging me onward. Near noon, as the sunlight broke through a hazy sky, I saw my brother chasing a stray dog through the snow. His laughter, high-pitched and unburdened, momentarily pierced the uneasy silence. I closed my eyes and held the sound in my heart. a reminder of something pure and untainted by worry. That was the last moment of genuine peace I would feel before the thunder came rolling in. For in the distance, beyond the hills and the icy creek, rumors of soldiers drew closer. Their footsteps were like the beats of an approaching drum, steady and unstoppable. My father's warning played in my mind. We are surrounded. Despite my trembling heart, I gripped the edge of my blanket and stood tall against the biting wind. We had no idea just how cruel that thunder would be, but I promised myself I would face it with all the courage my young soul could muster. Thus began my journey, a path marked by sorrow and blood, by courage and unbreakable bonds. In that hush before the storm, I could not imagine how deeply the coming tragedy would carve itself into my spirit. But the first shadows had already fallen, and the distant thunder was growing louder with each breath of wind. Chapter 2: Voices of the Wind. We traveled eastward under a pale winter sun, the sky veiled in a milky haze that muted our spirits. My mother clutched her shawl close, keeping my brother Tsunke in her sight. Father led our small family, his eagle-feathered hair dancing in the wind. Behind us, the ragged caravan of men, women, and children trudged through the snowdrifts, all seeking the same fragile promise of safety. I walked in the middle of the group, listening to the elders' hushed murmurs. Their voices drifted through the cold air like whispers of the ancestors, carrying both wisdom and despair. Some prayed aloud, calling upon the Great Spirit to protect us. Others simply stared at the horizon with empty, hollow eyes, their faith unraveling with each step. There was a heaviness in the air that clung to our lungs, making it difficult to breathe. At intervals, we stopped to rest. Children cried for warmth. Mothers rocked infants in their arms. The wind nipped at our skin, carrying the faint scent of burning wood from the distant encampments. I recall an old man. His name was Crooked Cloud, who had once served as a brave warrior in his youth. He slumped against his horse, coughing weakly into his hand. His cheeks hollowed by hunger and cold, he reminded me of a specter from stories meant to frighten naughty children. Even so, when our eyes met, he offered me a nod, as if to encourage me to keep walking. His silent strength touched my heart, and I thought, is this what remains of our warriors? Worn bones and coughing regrets? Still, his nod was all I needed to step forward again. By dusk, we reached a small clearing by a frozen creek. There, we set up a temporary camp. My father, along with other men, pitched tattered teepees against the icy wind. Women gathered what firewood they could find beneath the thin layers of frost and snow. We formed a circle of modest fires, and in that dance of flickering light, our faces looked like pale masks, each carrying its own private sorrow. A quiet meal was prepared, dried meat and whatever roots we managed to dig up. Food was scarce, but somehow, the small act of sharing brought a sense of unity to our desperate band. Around one fire, a mother tried to soothe her coughing child, singing a lullaby that I had once heard in my grandmother's teepee. The tune was haunting, a relic of happier times. I wanted to hold that melody in my heart forever, to keep it safe from the snow and wind and fear. That night, it began to snow more heavily. Fine crystals glittered like fragments of distant stars, swirling around me in a mournful dance. I sat outside our makeshift shelter, the cold biting my cheeks, and looked into the distance. My eyes found the shape of Chief Spotted Elk's shelter. A faint glow from inside suggested a gathering of the elders. I could almost feel their heartbeats, each one resonating with the burdens of a people on the brink. Suddenly, I heard my mother's voice calling for me. Her tone was sharp with concern. "Zintkala, do not wander too far," she said, brushing the snow from my shoulders. She wrapped her arms around me, and for a moment, her warmth cut through the icy air. I rested my head against her. "I'm sorry, Aina," I whispered, feeling like a child afraid of the dark. She just held me closer, her breathing unsteady. I sensed her tears more than I saw them, for in that moment, it felt as though all Mother's tears had found their way into the wind, carried on the breath of the plains. Once we returned to our shelter, my father came in, stooping to pass through the entrance. I could see the weariness carved into his face. He settled down beside us, tugging his blanket tighter around his shoulders. For a moment, we simply sat in silence, listening to the crackling of the small fire in the center. Then, quietly, he began to speak, his voice trembling with something deeper than cold. "Chief Spotted Elk. He says we should keep moving. The soldiers are close." My mother wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. "How soon?" My father shook his head. "Soon enough that we cannot stay here. We must press on at first light, or the bluecoats will catch us." My brother stirred from his restless sleep, blinking up at us. His small fingers curled around the edge of a worn buffalo robe. "Father, are the soldiers bad men?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. A pained look crossed my father's eyes. "They follow orders, Tasunke. Sometimes those orders hurt our people. We must be careful." The weight of those words pressed on my heart. I tried to imagine men who followed orders without listening to their own spirits. An image flickered through my mind. Faceless shapes in blue uniforms, moving like shadows across the snow. I shivered, swallowing the lump in my throat. Late into the night, the wind's howling seemed to speak, carrying the voices of our ancestors, those who had fought and bled for these lands. I wanted to cling to their courage, to believe that we could endure this trial. But there was a gnawing sense of dread deep in my stomach that would not be banished by wishful thinking. I lay down, hugging my brother close, and tried to sleep. Outside, the world was layered in cold and darkness, and I felt our hope ebbing away like the dying flames of our fire. When I finally drifted off, I dreamt of the ghost dance. My feet pounded rhythmically against the earth, kicking up dust that swirled like spirits. Faces, blurred yet familiar, formed a circle around me, all of them chanting, tears streaming down their cheeks. The beat of the drums echoed in my bones, and a voice whispered, "Our land, our people, they cry out for deliverance." I awoke with a start to find the sky still dark, the embers of our fire turned to gray ash. My heart raced, unsure of where dream ended and reality began. For a moment, I felt the presence of something divine, a fleeting assurance that though trials lay ahead, we were not alone. But as I looked at my slumbering family, the heaviness returned. Our journey was far from over. With each passing hour, the bluecoats drew nearer, and we were running out of places to hide. The voices of the wind continued to call out, bearing down with an ancient sadness. I wondered if it was truly the wind, or our ancestors, crying for what was to come. At dawn, we rose again. I shook the sleep from my eyes, tucked away my fear, and stepped into the cold, ready to follow my father's lead. We had no choice but to move forward, guided by a fragile hope that perhaps, somewhere along the road, the spirits would shield us from the looming darkness. We were Lakota, children of this vast, rolling land. And although we carried our fears like shadows, we also carried a fierce will to survive. Little did we know, our determination would soon be tested in ways we could never have imagined. The snow fell heavier, the clouds pressed lower, and the storm that haunted our steps was about to break. Chapter 3. The Ghost Dance Echo. Snow fell in thick, drifting sheets as we pressed on. The landscape around us looked bleached and endless, the vast whiteness swallowing up the horizon. Chief Spotted Elk's band, along with my father and mother, kept watchful eyes on the hills, wary of shadows that might signal approaching soldiers. My breath clouded in front of me, and each step felt heavier than the last. Still, I forced myself forward, remembering the promise I had made to protect my family. We trekked through the bitter cold until we reached a sheltered hollow near a winding creek. There, a new worry gripped our group. We saw ragged footprints, evidence that someone else had been through here recently. It could have been the Bluecoats, or perhaps other Lakota trying to escape. The uncertainty gnawed at my insides. My father signaled for silence, lifting his hand. No one dared speak. The wind carried eerie echoes across the plains, as though the spirits themselves walked beside us, mourning. My hands trembled around the small bag I clutched at my side. Inside, I carried a handful of beaded keepsakes and a medicine pouch given to me by my grandmother. "They will protect you," she used to say, "if your heart is pure." I prayed those words were true. Later that evening, when we decided to set up camp, a few of the older women began preparing a meager stew. The younger braves scouted the perimeter, bows and rifles in hand, their faces grim. I sat by a dying fire, hugging my blanket around me, trying to find comfort in the flickering light. My brother Tasunke lay curled at my feet, too tired to speak. My mother stroked his hair, humming a gentle lullaby to calm him. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed two figures stepping away from the circle. It was Wounded Lance, a brave with a chipped arrowhead necklace, and Fallen Sparrow, a woman well known for her healing abilities. Intrigued, I quietly rose and followed them at a distance. My heart fluttered with a mix of curiosity and worry. I found them at the far edge of our camp, where the wind whipped snow into ghostly shapes. Wounded Lance bowed his head toward Fallen Sparrow, and they exchanged urgent whispers. I couldn't catch every word, but fragments of their conversation reached my ears. Ghost dance, soldiers, fear, death. The haunting tone in their voices chilled me more than the winter air. I thought about the ghost dance, an act of desperate hope that our lands, our ancestors, and our way of life might be restored by the Great Spirit. I'd only glimpsed it once, late at night on the reservation, when men and women gathered in sacred circles, arms raised to the sky. They danced until their feet bled, chanting prayers to bring back the buffalo and the old ways. Even as a young girl, I sensed the power in that ritual, a force that stirred the marrow of my bones. Yet I had also heard how the Bluecoats feared it, misinterpreting our prayers as war cries. A sudden gust nearly blew me off balance. I steadied myself behind a snow-laden bush and listened further. Fallen Sparrow's voice trembled with emotion. "They say the soldiers are panicking. They believe our ghost shirts make us invincible. They want to end the dancing, by any means." Wounded Lance's reply was lost to the wind, but the weight in his posture said enough. My heart pounded against my chest. I knew then that whatever was to happen, it would be soon, and it would be dire. Fear for my people and for my family coiled inside me like a snake, ready to strike. I slipped back to the camp, careful not to be seen, and settled beside my mother. Her eyes flicked to mine, immediately sensing something was wrong. Gently, she reached for my hand. "Daughter, your spirit is uneasy. Speak." A lump formed in my throat. I glanced at Tasunke, asleep in her lap, and spoke in a soft voice. "Mother," I overheard Wounded Lance. "He said the Bluecoats fear our ghost dance. They might be planning something terrible." She closed her eyes, her jaw set in a determined line. "We have known fear for too long, but we must be strong. You must be strong." Tears threatened to spill down my cheeks. I clenched my blanket around me, recalling the dream I'd had of dancing Lakota, tears streaming down their faces as they pleaded with the spirits for mercy. Could the soldiers really think our prayers were a threat? When my father joined us, I could see the same worry reflected in his eyes. He held out a ragged piece of parchment, a note, hurriedly written in English. "One of the scouts found this," he explained. "It seems the Bluecoats are marching here. They believe we are preparing for war." A cold shudder ran down my spine. If the soldiers sought to stop us from dancing, from praying, they would come in force. My father wrapped an arm around me and my mother, and we stayed like that, a brief tableau of unity against the harsh winter. In that moment, the fire burned low, casting shadows across our faces. Perhaps, I thought, those shadows were a warning of things to come. Night blanketed the prairie once more, and the wind's moan became a mournful chant. Some in our group began to hum the ghost dance songs under their breath, as though trying to summon the courage of our ancestors. I recalled my grandmother's gentle hands guiding me through the steps, her voice trembling with the power of tradition and prayer. Finally, exhaustion overtook me. I lay down beside Tasunke and stared at the swirling flakes above. My eyelids grew heavy, thoughts drifting between hope and dread. The chant of the ghost dance echoed through my mind, blending with the howling wind in a sorrowful lullaby. As I slipped into restless sleep, a silent plea filled my heart. Spirits, if you can hear us, protect our people. Do not let fear and misunderstanding blind those who come against us. I did not know then that my prayer, whispered into the cold night air, would go unanswered. That the darkness creeping over our fate was more relentless than any storm. But for now, I clung to hope, however fragile, believing that somewhere in the swirling snow, a spark of mercy still glimmered. We were Lakota. Our blood had survived generations of struggle on these sacred lands. Yet in the quiet hush of that night, the ghost dance echo resonated like a distant drumbeat in my heart, an omen of the tragedy rushing toward us with the unstoppable force of a winter gale. Chapter 4. Shadows Across the Snow. Morning arrived wrapped in a bitter chill. Our camp stirred with an unspoken urgency. There was no time for lingering. As I roused from fitful dreams, I found my mother already packing our scant belongings. A thin crust of frost clung to her hair, and in her eyes, I saw the steely resolve of a woman determined to protect her family. My father and the other men were exchanging grave looks near a small fire. Chief Spotted Elk stood among them, his presence commanding respect despite his own frailties. He coughed into a bunched cloth as he spoke, his breath visible in the freezing air. The lines on his face carved deep from worry and illness, yet his spirit remained unwavering. "We move again," he announced, his voice carrying across the hush of our makeshift camp. "The soldiers advance quickly. We will follow Wounded Knee Creek and find shelter there." He paused, scanning the gathered families. "We must not lose hope. Our prayers guide us, and the spirits walk beside us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Even the children, though they understood little, sensed the gravity in our leader's tone. I felt a pang in my chest as I looked at my little brother Tasunke, who still rubbed sleep from his eyes. He should be free to run and play, not flee from gunfire and fear. Without further delay, we hoisted our bundles onto our backs and resumed our weary march. The crisp air bit at my lungs, and each exhale formed a small cloud before it was carried away by the wind. An ominous sky pressed low overhead, the heavy clouds threatening more snow. Despite the bleakness, I tried to focus on my surroundings. The bare cottonwood trees, the crackle of ice underfoot, the occasional flicker of a winter bird darting across the horizon. It was our land, even under the clutch of winter, and I clung to the simple fact that we belonged here. By midday, we reached a shallow bend in the creek. Our travelers, exhausted and anxious, paused to rest. Groups of women and children huddled together for warmth while the men scouted the area. The muddy banks, coated in ice, made it difficult for our horses to find footing. Each time one stumbled, my heart lurched, as if the land itself resisted our presence. A tense quiet settled over the camp. As we waited, My mother and I shared a small piece of dried deer meat. My stomach churned at the meager meal, but we had no choice. Food was scarce, and we had to conserve. Nearby, Tasunke kicked at a patch of frozen reeds, his small breath hitching from the cold. I rubbed my hands together and placed them over his ears, trying to shield him from the relentless wind. Before long, one of the scouts came running, breath ragged. He stammered in alarm, pointing north. My father rushed to his side. "What is it? Soldiers?" The young man nodded, eyes wide with terror. "They're close, father. I saw their wagons and guns, more than we can count." A tremor swept through our camp. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers instinctively reached for their rifles or bows. Chief Spotted Elk stood with difficulty, leaning on his staff. He motioned for all to gather. "We cannot run forever," he said, voice heavy. "Some of us are too weak, too ill. We must seek terms, lay down arms if we must." Fear coiled in my belly like a living thing. I glanced at my mother, whose jaw was set with silent determination. My father's brow furrowed, his hand tightening around the shaft of his lance. The idea of surrender, of trusting the bluecoats, filled us all with dread. Yet what choice remained? If we fought, our children and the elderly would be the first to suffer. If we ran, we would be hunted like animals across the plains, with nowhere left to hide. The sun slipped behind a bank of storm clouds, casting a gray gloom over the frozen creek. Chief Spotted Elk, coughing again, reached out to clasp my father's shoulder. "We will go peacefully," he repeated. "Let them see we do not wish to fight." His words settled on us like a heavy blanket. All we could do was nod, uncertain of our fate but unwilling to risk total slaughter. The new plan spread quickly. We would travel further along the creek and meet with the soldiers to negotiate surrender. The older men tried to reassure us. "The Great Spirit will protect us," they murmured, but I saw the doubt in their eyes. We had all heard the stories of broken treaties, of Lakota forced onto reservations where hunger and death lurked at every corner. Still, perhaps there was a chance. Perhaps a spark of mercy existed in the hearts of the bluecoats. As twilight neared, we made camp near a shallow bend in Wounded Knee Creek, choosing a depression in the landscape that offered some shelter from the wind. This would be where we spent the night. A hush fell upon our people, a collective breath held tight. The sound of the creek running beneath thin ice was the only music to punctuate our dread. Near the edge of camp, a small group began the ghost dance, even though the rest of us were wary of fueling the soldiers' suspicions. Their movements were slow and languid, more reverent than celebratory. The dancers' arms lifted toward the darkening sky, beseeching the ancestors for intervention. Soft chanting rose in the still air, a plea for salvation, for the return of our bison herds, for peace beyond the anguish that bound us. Transfixed by the sight, I stood just beyond the firelight. Snow settled on my shoulders, mingling with tears I hadn't realized were slipping down my cheeks. In that fragile moment, our dancers appeared almost ethereal, their white breath merging with swirling snowflakes. How could this harmless prayer provoke such fear in the bluecoats? My heart twisted as I watched them, longing to join, longing to find solace in the dance. Yet a quiet, gnawing fear held me back. Behind me, my father's voice emerged in the darkness. "Come, Zintkala, it's best we stay close as a family." I turned to find him gazing at me with gentle concern. Nodding, I wiped my tears with the back of my hand and followed him to where Mother and Tasunke lay huddled. He draped an extra blanket over my shoulders. We settled down, our meager fire casting trembling shadows across our faces. Minutes stretched into hours as the darkness deepened, and the chanting of the ghost dance faded into the night. All the while, I heard my own heartbeat pounding. Tomorrow, we would face the bluecoats. Tomorrow, we would attempt to surrender or negotiate terms. Tomorrow, the destiny of our people would be decided, either by words or by bullets. I closed my eyes, sinking into an uneasy slumber. My last thought was a prayer that the Great Spirit would guide our steps at dawn. The faint crackle of dying embers was the lullaby that carried me into the arms of restless dreams. I saw fleeting images of the ancestors, their faces streaked with tears, as if they already knew the horror that would unfold along that frozen creek. In that half-dream realm, I felt a warning ripple through my soul. The shadows across the snow were growing darker, and soon we would be plunged into a night no sunrise could chase away. Chapter 5. The Bloodied Dawn. Dawn broke with a grim hush. Lead-gray clouds choked the sky, and the wind that coursed over the plains bore an icy sting. We awoke to find that the bluecoats had arrived, forming a ring around our camp. Their uniforms stood out starkly against the snow. Horses stamped and snorted, their breath clouding in the sharp air, while the barrels of the soldiers' rifles glinted beneath the weak sun. Chief Spotted Elk struggled to stand. Despite his illness, he presented himself with dignity. Beside him, a few of our men stepped forward, hands raised to show they carried no weapons in aggression. I gripped Tasunke's hand, hiding behind my father's broad figure. My heart thundered so wildly that it drowned out nearly everything else. One soldier dismounted and approached. He wore a stern expression, his face as cold as the winter wind. The translator at his side called out, "You are under arrest. We will take your weapons." A ripple of alarm swept through our group. Mothers huddled around their children. Warriors bristled but held their tongues. We knew that resistance would mean death. Reluctantly, rifles, bows, and knives were surrendered. My father quietly removed the small hatchet from his belt, handing it over without a word. I watched as he clenched his jaw, a muscle twitching at his temple. Tasunke let out a small whimper, sensing the danger. We had been corralled into a circle near Wounded Knee Creek, the banks lined with swirling snow and ice. Soldiers posted themselves on small rises and behind wagons, rifles poised. Their cannons, or Hotchkiss guns, as I had heard them called, pointed ominously toward us. Even to my young eyes, it was evident we were surrounded by overwhelming force. Chief Spotted Elk tried to speak, his voice cracking with pain. "We come in peace. We do not wish to fight." But the soldier who seemed to be in charge cut him off with a curt gesture. Without warning, confusion erupted on the far side of our group. Several soldiers converged on a Lakota man, Black Coyote, I would later learn his name, who was apparently deaf and did not understand their demands. He refused to give up his rifle, shouting that he had paid much for it and needed it to hunt for food. The soldiers insisted, voices rising with anger. Then chaos. A shot rang out, no one knew from which side. Thunder cracked through the freezing air. The world seemed to freeze for a heartbeat, and then everything shattered. Gunfire erupted in a deafening roar. The soldiers' rifles spat flames. Screams tore through the morning light. My vision blurred with panic as I saw men, women, and children collapsing in the snow. One moment, I stood beside Tasunke and my parents. The next, the crush of bodies and choking gun smoke stole them from my view. I heard my mother scream my name, "Zintkala!" Somewhere in the chaos, her voice shrill with terror. A sudden impact knocked me to the ground. I gasped, choking on the acrid smell of gunpowder. When I tried to rise, bodies fell around me, heavy and limp. Cries filled the air, mingling with the furious staccato of rifles and the hollow boom of the cannons. Through the frenzied chaos, I glimpsed soldiers moving among our people, firing mercilessly at those who tried to flee. Blood splattered across the snow, staining it a deep, sickening red. The roar of guns was unrelenting, drowning out even the screams. I could see nothing but white smoke and red stains, hear nothing but the thunderous rattle of death. A wave of cold fury and sheer terror surged within me. My entire body shook, and though I wanted to cry out, No sound came from my throat. At some point, I managed to crawl behind a small embankment of snow. My breath came in ragged bursts. My heart hammered as if it would burst from my chest. Where is Tasunke? Where are mother and father? Even in the maelstrom, I remembered my vow. I had promised to protect them. Gathering every ounce of courage, I forced my trembling limbs to move. Keeping low to the ground, I crawled through the drifts, ignoring the biting cold that seeped through my clothing. Gunshots cracked overhead. My vision swam from the mingled stench of blood and gunpowder. Then, a small figure appeared before me, hunched over in the snow. Tasunke. His eyes were wild with fear, tears streaming down his cheeks. I stumbled toward him, arms outstretched. Tasunke, I cried, my voice raw. He turned, reaching for me like a lost child. Suddenly, a deafening explosion ripped the air. One of the cannons fired a shell, crashing into the fleeing crowd. Shrapnel whizzed past, and a searing pain tore across my upper arm. I screamed, collapsing onto my side. Sparks of light burst in my vision. Through the haze of agony, I saw Tasunke's small body land awkwardly in the snow. Gasping, I clawed my way to him. The world spun, a haze of swirling smoke and swirling snow. Blood trickled down my arm, hot and wet, but I ignored it. All that mattered was my brother. When I reached him, he wasn't moving. No matter how desperately I shook him, his eyes remained closed. No, no. The scream tore from my throat, raw and wounded. My tears fell onto his pale cheeks, my chest convulsing with sobs. Gunfire persisted, relentless, like a deadly drumbeat. In that horrible moment, time stretched into a nightmare. It was as if the sky, the earth, and the spirits themselves wept with me, their grief echoing in the wail of the wind. I don't know how long I stayed there, cradling my brother. Eventually, the gunfire died down, replaced by distant cries and moans. I looked around with numb disbelief. Bodies lay scattered in the snow. Grandmothers, warriors, infants, chiefs, our people. The river of blood and melting snow ran thick and silent. When at last the final shots ceased, and the bluecoats moved among the fallen, a hollow hush descended, colder than any wind could ever be. My vision blurred, but I refused to let go of Tasunke. I refused to leave the place where my family might still be found, though in my heart, I feared the worst. In that bleak dawn, the world had changed forever. The sun, finally breaking through the gray clouds, revealed a scene of unimaginable horror. Wounded Knee Creek, once just a name, had become a symbol of bloodshed and despair. And I, Zintkala, once a girl full of laughter and hope, felt my soul shatter like glass beneath the boots of soldiers. The massacre was over, but its echoes would reverberate through the ages, haunting our land and our memories. There, among the fallen, I closed my eyes, clinging to my silent brother and the last remains of a world that had been torn from us. The tears that fell into the crimson snow were not just mine. They belonged to every Lakota who had prayed for peace and found only death. I did not yet know the full weight of what had happened, or why the soldiers' terror and hatred had rained down upon us so mercilessly. But as I knelt there in the bloodied dawn, I felt the final breath of my childhood slip away with the winter wind. We were Lakota. We were proud. And no matter how many of us fell that day, our spirits would endure. Somewhere in the eternal embrace of these ancient plains, and in the memory of every survivor left to mourn.
김시장 하실라 다 손끝하고 희우야 아파하 니 자지 바뀌는 니 차야 대시가 이 지스니오니 알라야 이 부러지는 독사 Wanachaya mapio kichize Hopinya takuwa kangi chaglapi Vuesha kelila vuksape Hetaku kithawa waya kawichoza He halkingang happy ayapi Voya taking hengung For watching out the Voy kahecha voy taking oahe chikia Pesi hoglu jangia tangi yang kawiyo kibishicha Ni chaji pahe wang wachia Voksape hesate vlobloka Wachiwa wanyang kehechapdu 비킹이 차가비 혹시 잘알 무엇이냐 원하자요 같은 나 피지세 어디냐다고 와카위 차가비 무에샤겔리라 북사페 했다고 기타가 와야 왕가위 초사 해할기만 헬비아야비 Taking hell for watching young gone Egna ke wachi we choni kiam Tanging shashkin hecha akecha ni cha Ta taking wachi laga ni chake kinoi hasan laga Wanachaya mapio kichize Hopinyataku wakangi chaglavi Hechelu muachni ngomni Vuvesha keking leli